No one can violate your boundaries. They can test them, but only you can violate them.
I don't do business with desperate people.
Then you got upset at them because they exposed the fact that you were never that serious about your boundary in the first place.
Only you can violate your boundary. There's an energy around desperation that's just, it never ends well.
Boundary is something we put on ourselves to say, I am not staying in this situation if it's this way. Welcome to the In Search of More podcast. I am your host, Eli Nash. Join me weekly on my quest for more from myself and more from this world. We'll see you on the other side. So I want to explore something with you. Not 100% sure what I think about this. I heard it. It caught my attention. So I wanted to throw it in between us, bounce it around, and see where it goes.
Okay, let's do it.
It's at a conference, and the speaker says, no one can violate your boundaries. They can test them, but only you can violate them.
Say that again.
No one can violate your boundaries. Someone else can test them, but only you can violate them.
Okay. Speak on that. Unpack that for me. What are your thoughts on that?
My first thought is to strip away the no one can ever, let's not talk no one can ever, because
No absolute.
Right. Maybe there is an absolute, but once we start thinking in that way, it's hard to understand what the person's saying. But let's say, so let me tone it down a little bit to understand it. Generally, when we talk about boundary violation, that's not happening. What we're talking about is boundary testing. And then we decide whether or not we violate it. So let's think of an example. So let's say I have a boundary. I will not be spoken to in a certain way. Let's say that's my boundary.
Okay.
Or what? I don't know. I just won't be, right? That's the boundary.
Mm-hmm.
So if someone has spoken to me in that way that I've determined is unacceptable to me, then actually have a better example. Example came up last week. So someone reached out to me in the morning and said, do you have time to meet today? And I said, no, I kind of got a busy day. And a few hours later, hey, I'm outside your office. I figured maybe you have 2 or 3 minutes. They were visiting from out of town. I'm outside your office.
Unannounced.
Well, not unannounced. They asked me in the morning whether or not I have time. I said I didn't. So they showed up, said it would only be 2-3 minutes. Definitely a year ago, I would have been outside talking to this guy. He traveled all the way, saw me here. It's just a couple of minutes, even though it's never just a couple of minutes. But it wasn't about whether it's just a couple of minutes. It was about the boundary. So in that case, the boundary was tested. I'm right outside because I set the boundary in the morning. I don't have time today. The boundary was tested. I'm right outside. It wasn't violated because I didn't violate it. Had I gone outside, I could have been upset at him for violating my boundary. He asked me afterwards if I was offended. I said I wasn't. I just didn't have time. But I would have been offended if I went outside.
Right.
But I wasn't offended because I didn't go outside.
I hear that and I think about only you can violate your boundary. So what about, I'm thinking, let's say, as examples, tee this up for you. Emotional boundaries versus physical boundaries.
Okay.
How can someone not violate my physical boundary? How can someone only test it, but I got to be the one that violated?
So let's say in this example, I didn't get a call from the receptionist that he was outside or a message from him, but when I was walking out to my car, they were there.
Mm-hmm.
Could I say the same thing? Could I say they've only tested it by being there, but now I can just step in my car and drive away and they didn't violate it? What did you mean by emotional boundaries before?
Emotional boundaries, meaning let's say through past experience, you've recognized some of some of your habits inside of relationships. Like you tend to be clingy, for example, or you tend to be, don't take feedback well, or you're not very like receptive to feedback, or whatever the case is. And you know that about yourself. You accepted it, cool, whatever. Right. And you've made certain guidelines, like you said, like I'm not going to let myself fall in love in the first 6 months because I know I get clingy, or whatever the case is, whatever might justify that. I think it's easier. That makes sense, right? Like for you to violate your own boundary when it comes to like emotional boundaries. But with physical, I don't know if it's necessarily, if I can stand on that same perspective where it's like, I have to violate it. Because let's say, for example, like my boundary is like 3 feet.
And someone walks into
my
or maybe
space.
A practical example, let's say someone was.
That's what I was thinking about, right.
Right. Let's say someone was. So would I say the same thing? I guess I wouldn't use that language, right? No one would go to court and say, Your Honor, this man violated the boundary of this woman.
Right.
Like he did, but he did he didn't violate it. Like he
obliterated it. So does it stand up still where it's like only you can violate your own boundaries?
So right, in that way, that's why we have to relax to no one. But maybe there's another way of saying it. This is what I'm thinking. So what is a boundary? We're not really putting a boundary on someone else. That's never what this was about anyway. We're putting a boundary on ourselves. It's not that no one can ever violate a boundary. Let's define what a boundary is. A boundary is something that I put on myself. I don't take a meeting that's not scheduled at the beginning of the day. That's my boundary. That's not their boundary.
Right.
This guy clearly doesn't have that boundary.
Right. Showed up, I'm outside.
Right. And for him, maybe it's a good story, and maybe it worked a bunch of times.
Right.
Maybe his biggest client, his wife came out like this. I'm not questioning his way of working. It works for him. I have a boundary. I don't take meetings that aren't scheduled, that aren't pre-scheduled. Let's say that's my boundary. Or I am not spoken to in a certain way. That is my boundary.
Yeah.
And then when that happens, do I stay or do I leave? Like, meaning, do I preserve the integrity of the boundary? Or do I say, oh, now that it's been tested by someone else, now I really don't have this boundary for myself? Because it really doesn't make any sense to say that I'm putting a boundary on you. It was never about your boundaries. It was my boundaries. Boundaries are on me. I think that's what the message of the guy was, of the speaker. Yeah. It's not that no one can violate our boundaries. Of course, someone can come and obliterate someone else's boundary. But it's what is a boundary? A boundary is something we put on ourselves to say, I am not staying in this situation if it's this way. And then someone can test, are you serious about that?
Right.
Like, do you really mean that when you say that, or are you going to hang around?
Right.
When you said you're not taking meetings that aren't scheduled at the beginning of the day, did you mean that or not? So they tested what you meant about your own boundary and then demonstrated to you that you weren't that serious about it. Yeah. And then you got upset at them because they exposed the fact that you were never that serious about your boundary in the first place.
Yeah, and I like what you said. I like the fact that you said that a boundary, it's about us, because I think a lot of people, myself included, oftentimes look at boundaries as having to do with the other person, more so, right? Like, I'm setting this boundary for you when it's really about yourself. And I think about the hard lessons I've learned with boundaries. Like, one of my boundaries now is that I don't do business with desperate people, because there's an energy around desperation that's just, it never ends well. They could be the best person, well-intentioned, but just the energy around desperation, it's almost like it's this energy that usually doesn't end well at some point, right? So
that's a perfect example.
Yeah, no business with desperate people.
Perfect example.
And I've learned the hard way.
So if a desperate person comes and you end up doing business with them, did they violate your boundary? Or did you violate your boundary?
Yeah, I did, 100%.
Right, because the boundary was always about you.
Right.
Because a desperate person needs someone to do business with.
Right.
They don't have that boundary. You do. And they tested it. Are you serious about it?
Right.
Let's find out.